This is the
Five Stars
podcast.
Let me talk to you.
Hi.
So, what do you guys want to talk about? Tell me we're not telling lies.
Thanks, guys. Back to you.
I was thinking about doing some kind of fancy intro for the final show of the year. Couldn't think of anything creative, though. So we're going to stick with the boring intro. But that doesn't mean today's conversation is going to be boring. We're going to have a lot of fun with this one. At least that's the goal. It is going to be the final show of the year. And I've done these little year-in review specials for the last few years I've been running the channel. It always ends up becoming an editing nightmare. But I do like doing these little annual recap shows. Kind of forces me to put my thinking cap on and reflect back on stuff we covered throughout the year. See how much I actually remember. And in the case of me reflecting back on my favorite matches, gives me an opportunity to go back and rewatch a lot of that footage. And this is as good a week as any to do it. So welcome everybody to the 5 Starr Wrestling Report. This is the wrestling channel nobody knows but everybody needs. Here on YouTube and Rumble every Monday and Friday to bring you some laid-back, chill wrestling discourse. And at the time of this recording, this will be our 4th year, I believe. Yeah, that sounds right. I kickstarted the channel back in late summer of 2021. And at the time, I really didn't know how far things would go. But the more I kept getting back into the flow of watching wrestling and piecing together a weekly channel format that seemed practical, the more I enjoyed doing it. It was never something I expected to make a career out of. I knew that was always going to be virtually impossible. You want to talk about swimming up crap creek without a paddle. And especially with how the landscape of YouTube has changed in the last 10 or so years. Maybe back in like 2010 when I started my YouTube channel for the first time, if I put my nose to the grind and built an audience like I did on my previous channel incarnation, it may have been a different story. But, well, for sake of time, I just kind of want to forget about that previous channel. If you know, you know. I'm not proud of it. It's private now. It's more of a personal account for me than anything. And while the growth of this channel has been gradual, sluggish at times, again, I'm not trying to do this for clout or money. I get the reality of where podcasting is in 2024. The competition is way too stiff. And because of the way YouTube algorithms have changed, even just in the last several years, even if I wanted to grow the channel rapidly and tried to be some kind of viable competitor in the wrestling community, God, nowadays, even the boys have their own podcasts. And their traction is already 50 steps ahead of any potential audience I could ever gain from scratch. And albeit I would consider this channel more of a niche channel than anything. Because I try to gear more toward the classic side of things. If somebody's mainly fixated on modern content and they want to hear reports on Raw, SmackDown, Dynamite, the pay-per-views, whatever. I mean, I still plan on doing WWE PLEs in 2025, but as I'll talk about later on, I don't really plan on changing any of the structure to what I'm doing on these shows. And no, not to try to get too personal here, but since we are talking about the landscape of my channel and just general BS, people might wonder, well, okay, so you claim you're not trying to do this for money, so is it really just a hobby for you? Is that even a thing anymore? Do people strictly start YouTube channels just because they feel like it? Because they enjoy it? Well, the answer quite simply is yes. Never intended for it to be any other way. I always joke about it, but I'm just some geek on the internet that's watched wrestling for the better part of 30 years. I still love the business, even though it's been fundamentally neutered and destroyed. But at the same time, it's kind of been a way for me to escape the realities of the real world. I'm not necessarily somebody that enjoys people. I'm not an extrovert. I don't look for excuses to go out and socialize with people. I've tried, but I've never been wired that way. And has it cost me friend groups along the way? Have I lost touch with some of the more important people in my life? Yeah, probably. But, the older I get, with age comes wisdom. And you kind of start to realize, well, if those people cared so much, maybe they would reach out once in a blue moon to ask how you're doing. That's when you come to realize who your true friends are. The ones that actually bother to stay in contact with you occasionally. And again, yes, I have my own worst enemy in a lot of cases. I can only blame myself because I don't do Facebook, I don't do Twitter, I don't do Instagram. Again, I understand how the real world operates now. This is like the primary way people communicate is through social media. It was a cognitive decision on my part. I tried that stuff. I was just fed up with all the drama, just endless scrolling of people talking about stuff that you don't care about. And again, the older I get, I start to realize that for somebody like myself, and I'm only in my early 30s, but there's really only 3 things that have ever truly mattered to me in this world. I guess you would say the 3 fundamental things that I've always loved. My parents, music, and pro wrestling. Those have been the 3 stable pieces to my life. The 3 things that have never let me down, never burned me or made me feel less than as a person. The 3 things that I know I'll always appreciate. And, even removing the parents from the conversation, we can just talk about the materialistic side of things. Music and wrestling. It might kind of be sad to admit this out loud. Those are really the only 2 things I've ever been good at. I was a music major in undergrad. I worked my ass off, tried to get better, and I'm still active in the field. I'm working in music right now and trying to make a career out of it. I would say I'm doing okay for myself. But I still listen to music all the time. I write music whenever I get the chance. There's the job aspect of it, yes, but there's also the passion aspect of it. And both of those things have never died. They've always been there to pick me up whenever I need the lift. I really don't have a whole lot else in my life to rely on. Now, it does keep things moderately simple for me. And yeah, you're always going to have the people that are saying, you're just coasting through life and taking the easy way out. No, you know what? Maybe I am, maybe I'm not. I don't try to force things to happen that aren't going to happen organically. And why should I force it? If there's only 3 universal things in my life that truly matter, family, music, and wrestling, well, you know what? That's all I've got. And I'll accept that. That's not me sulking. I'm not trying to garner sympathy out of anybody. It's reality. It's me coming to grips with the fact that maybe I don't really need anything else in my life. At least in order to be satisfied. I don't need a 6-figure salary to be happy. I don't need giant friend groups to be happy. I love what I do now. Some days are obviously better than others, I'll admit. And I still work out. I still try to eat healthy. Weather permitting, I like to go outside and take walks or just enjoy nature. It's not like I'm a vampire. And I don't want to give off any impression that I'm depressed or anything. I mean, if you asked me, I would probably argue that I have some kind of undiagnosed depression syndrome. Not enough to where I'm concerned about my health or anything, but I know what the solutions are. I just try to keep myself busy and, again, doing stuff like this. Coming on here and talking to the people about wrestling. I assume that the people who subscribe to this channel, or even the ones that just come back to check the show out, I presume we have some type of common bond or common interest. Elsewise, why are you watching? But I think that's enough self-deprecating for the next 12 months. I think it's time we get into the meat of today's show. And before we talk about the good stuff, my list of favorite matches, I think we should start by just talking about my general thoughts on wrestling this year. And you know, while I was preparing for this show, I put a lot of thought into how I even wanted to dive into this topic. Wrestling recap in 2024. I think everybody's already done some kind of blanket breakdown of the various storylines that we've seen throughout the year. My intent really wasn't to do a month-by-month analysis of WWE's timeline, nor would I say I'm qualified to do so, considering I've only primarily paid attention to the PLEs. In anything I've seen of the television product, it's all been YouTube clips. But I think when I just look at the state of wrestling as a whole, I mean, there is a lot we can dive deeper into. Well, let's just start with the obvious question. What are your thoughts on the current state of the product? Well, there are a couple caveats here. Bearing in mind that I haven't really covered much modern wrestling this past year, if you go back a couple years, you know that we would try to stay more in touch with what's going on in the modern market. But a lot has changed for me. I've scrapped the AEW reports. I haven't even thought about returning to watch Dynamite. Collision and Rampage, those shows are completely irrelevant at this stage. They're finally canceling Rampage after 2 years of failure. You know, I wonder what took them so long. But that's just AEW. You know, even on the WWE side of things, I don't really have much of a drive to talk extensively about Raw or SmackDown. I kind of dropped the SmackDown reports cold turkey because I found myself skipping or fast-forwarding through a lot of that stuff that I didn't care about. Turns out there was a lot more than I expected. It's just, I don't know, dude. The more time I spend talking about classic wrestling, the more I wind up dissociating myself from anything happening in the current modern pull of wrestling. Now, it's easy enough for me to sit here and talk about the ongoing list of AEW's unresolved problems. I spent the better part of the last 3 years on this channel beating that rotting corpse. And as they're about to close out another chapter in their company's existence, I mean, yeah, they're surely coasting over the finish line, but has the product ever been any more ice cold? And again, the problems, they still lie directly with one person. We can point fingers and try to blame this camp or that camp, but the buck stops with Tony Khan. And that has been the core issue with AEW's existence since the very beginning. Every negative thing that happens to this company, all the bad publicity, the company drama, talent issues in the locker room, the booking, the lack of reasonable communication, that's probably been one of the biggest red flags. The fact that Tony doesn't communicate with anybody and that he ghosts all the problems that fall at his feet. He's not an active problem solver. He never has been. And we're at the point now, especially when you look at the state of AEW. It almost seems like Tony's deliberately doubling or even tripling down on all the bad shit. The stuff that everybody's warned him. Hey, Tony, maybe you ought to consider not pushing Wheeler Yuta or Orange Cassidy because they're actively driving away viewers. Or, hey, Tony, instead of blackballing guys like Ricky Starks or FTR or Wardlow because they were on good terms with CM Punk once upon a time, how about you try to capitalize on the fact that they're actually good for business? Or instead of catering to an ever-decreasing niche audience that loves all this bad outlaw indie bullshit, how about you actually try to make stars out of the talent people want to see? But no. Now, instead, Tony continues to let all the bad influences dominate his better judgment, giving Moxley virtually full creative control of his own story content. How's that working out for you, dude? Continuing to make MJF a less marketable and less valuable talent the more he involves himself in this fucking Adam Cole garbage, which, mind you, has been dead in the water for over a year. Think about that. Right before I stopped doing the AEW Dynamite reports, that feud was still ongoing. I see what people are talking about on the internet. I'm seeing that even the most loyal, diehard fans are finally starting to catch up to all the problems that people like me have been addressing since practically the very beginning. And it's easy enough for me to shrug at him and be like, cool, what took you so long? But even a blind squirrel eventually finds a nut. You can't ignore all the easily identifiable problems forever before they smack you in the face like a brick. The declining ratings, massive loss in ticket sales, them having to book smaller venues and finally coping with the fact that they're not able to run these big buildings anymore because half the fucking place is tarped off with all the empty seats. The lack of company morale or intrigue. It's all staring you right in the face. You can't ignore the issues now. Even Dave Meltzer's finally catching up to that fact. So, at this point, is it still too early to break out the I told you so cliche? And moreover, let's try to be constructive in this conversation. Things are getting progressively worse. What is Tony doing to turn anything around in the coming year? They're about to simulcast their weekly television shows on Max in 2025. They just re-signed that multi-million-dollar contract extension to stay with WBD. Since that point, the on-screen product has only gotten worse. People are saying this past fall season has been some of the worst television AEW's done across all three brands, but especially with their flagship program on Wednesdays. What is Tony doing to help turn things around? He continues to drive off viewers with the bad booking. Ticket sales are only going down. I can only presume that because of his eventual streaming simulcast with Dynamite, it's only going to reduce the ratings even more. And what's the excuse going to be then? Ratings don't matter anymore because streaming is in? Is that going to be the new Wrestling Observer spin? All those talks about how the ratings are everything, how the key demo is everything. Now that we finally approached record low numbers for both the overall viewership and the key demo, well, now the goalposts are finally shifting. Figures. But these are not mutually exclusive problems. They're all intertwined. And you can applaud AEW for getting that sweet deal. Yeah, it keeps them on primetime television as they start moving more into these streaming platforms. But where's the audience growth? Where's the positive publicity? How is their current television product helping to expand the network's hope that this wasn't just a raw deal? Because even if what WBD is paying for is considered cheap programming, somebody at the network is seeing those stats. Somebody in corporate is monitoring the rapid decline in overall viewership on a month-by-month basis. And I don't know how it works when it comes to new network deals. I don't know if there's a retraction period in those clauses or if WBD can pull out from that relationship should things really go south. I'm not saying that's likely to happen in 2025. But when you look at where things are at now, they're not getting any better. Which kind of brings me to the WWE conversation. When we talk about the state of where they're at headed into 2025, God, you want to talk about flipping the script. The difference between comparing WWE versus AEW in 2024 to even say where they were in 2021 or early to mid 2022. Holy cow. I mean, they're doing record business. And even if I really don't have much of an emotional attachment to what happens on the TV product, I can't deny that there's an audience for what they're currently marketing. It's a much different audience than the people that consume AEW weekly. But they're about to go to Netflix with Raw on January 6th. They got a really stacked card that they've promoted well in advance. They have stars that are over. They're continuing to broaden their international market with all these PLEs they're running across the globe. Whatever formula they're running, it's working. And yes, a lot of it helped when Vince finally stepped down. I think that really helped to move the needle forward in a positive direction because now there's actually an incentive for previously disgruntled employees to either want to come back to WWE or just root for the product in general. And all those guys that jumped ship to AEW and wanted out of their contracts just a few years ago, I think a lot of them are looking at the lifeboats just trying to swim back. Save us, Hunter. This place sucks. But just thinking about everything we've talked about with WWE over the last 12 months, they're still running the Bloodline story, which, albeit I've kind of gotten bored with, but they've still kept it moderately interesting with bringing in Jacob Fatu, Tama Tonga, and Tongaloa. They've been good additions. Seemingly running with Roman Reigns as a babyface post-Mania, which has actually worked. God, all those fucking years they try to force that guy down everybody's throat as a babyface. And the people rejected it every single God blessed time. But look at how natural he's managed to get himself over with this audience. Just for wanting to come back to reclaim his position as the tribal chief. And we'll get into the CM Punk Drew McIntyre stuff when we go over my top 10 match list. You know, again, I haven't been a fan of everything I've watched on the PLEs this year. But the conversation really goes back to star power. I do not recall a time in recent memory, especially in the last 10 or so years, that I've watched WWE and said, never in the history of this promotion have the matches meant any less. Think about that. It is all about the promos. It is all about the angles. It's all about star presence. They are literally talking people into buying tickets at record numbers. It is just... It is so baffling for me to even conceive the idea that people are more absorbed in hearing people argue with each other on a microphone than to see the actual matches pay off. But you look at some of the highest rated TV segments, YouTube clips, social media engagement. The matches are not the draws. It's the talent. It's the name power. It's the promo packages. It's kind of how things used to be back when work rate didn't become so important. And yes, the matches are absolutely a crucial part to everything that happens. You cannot dismiss those. However, they are not the most crucial thing. And that, I think, is a huge disconnect between indie-minded wrestling fans versus a more mainstream market. And again, while all of these positive changes are not going to get me to want to watch the full TV shows at any point, just because I know a lot of it won't appeal to me, it gives me more of a reason to check out the clips involving these guys. The CM Punks, the Drew McIntyres, the Cody Rhodes, the Roman Reigns of the world. I will gladly go out of my way to seek their content out. And especially as we gear up for Rumble and Mania season, you know, this is the prime time to be paying close attention to WWE. That 4-month window between January and early April, those are always the peak months for WWE all year. And with everything they've teased throughout 2024, the stories they've been building up over time, I'm very optimistic about the future direction of WWE. You know, again, not optimistic enough for me to want to dish out money for another streaming service, but optimistic enough for me to say, I'll keep watching the PLEs and stay posted with their content throughout 2025. And, for all those people that are going to imply, he's just a WWE shill now, let me reiterate, because I know people have a short attention span. I have not been an advocate for everything WWE has done this past year. I still disagree with them introducing women's mid-card belts. I think it's a complete waste of time and effort. I still think there's way too much emphasis on not just women's wrestling, but bad women's wrestling. I know it's topical. I mean, we only talked about the match a month and a half ago. That War Games match with the girls, it was easily one of the worst things I've seen take place on any pay-per-view or live event in the last several years. And that's across any wrestling promotion, including anything I've ever covered in AEW. It was god-fucking awful. Nobody disputed that. Across the board. Whether you were a hardcore fan, casual fan, WWE hater, WWE advocate, everybody agreed that match fucking sucked. And I think WWE ought to really consider giving the girls their own 1-hour show, completely independent of anything they do on Raw or SmackDown. And if you are going to have the girls wrestle on those 2 primary shows, it's got to be the girls that are actually over with the audience. The Rhea Ripleys, the Bianca Belairs, the Baileys of the world. The ones that actually do well for them in the ratings. That, I think, is going to be the biggest conversation to be had with WWE this coming year. Especially with the fact that now they have 2 brand new women's belts that they have to try to get over. I mean, I already thought things were way too 50-50 with the amount of booking between girls and guys segments on shows. It's about to get astronomically more intolerable. I do not like the current direction they're going with that. But I'm going to keep criticizing it because it's a conversation that needs to be had. Some people are willing to talk about this kind of stuff. But for the people that don't want to ruffle any feathers, they're trying to stay clear of the conversation entirely because we wouldn't want to offend the girls. I'm not afraid to have the conversation. I'll be at the helm. I'll have that discussion until we're blue in the face. There's way too much bad women's wrestling going on right now. And it needs to stop because it's driving people away. But again, kind of going back to what I was talking about with Tony doubling down on all the bad shit, WWE is doing the same thing when it comes to the booking of the girls. But it's not just that. It's other stuff. I've talked about the Judgment Day. I haven't cared about any of their stuff in a very long time. The tag division's almost completely non-existent. I mean, Christ, when's the last time I even reviewed a tag team championship match on this channel? Question is, can I even name the tag team champions offhand? What did they do at WrestleMania? They did the unification match, right? And I think R-Truth and Miz won. But I know for a fact the belts have switched hands. I mean, think about this. Talking about the state of the tag division right now. Have I even mentioned the Motor City Machine Guns one time? Those guys have been under WWE contracts for months. Have we seen them appear on any of the premium live events? Not to my recollection. And on the subject of tag teams, you got the New Day stuff. I think it's kind of early for me to dictate how that's all going to play out. I did watch the Raw segment where Kofi and Xavier turned on Big E, the whole 10-year reunion special or whatever it was. Once I got over my antipathy for them dressing up the ring with cereal and pancakes and unicorns farting out rainbows, the interaction I thought was pretty good. Kofi's still a horrible actor, but I mean, they did manage to turn the guy heel. I think for the first time in history. That takes a lot of effort to turn a guy like Kofi Kingston heel. Has Kofi ever been a heel? I don't think he has. It's certainly different. So, I mean, I could go on for another hour, but it was a grab bag. But I'll tell you, the stuff that I did like, you're about to hear me cover that as we move into the second half of the podcast today. And by the way, editor's note here, just to put the finishing touches on the AEW conversation. Those problems I mentioned, they will only continue to persist until Tony Khan steps down from his active duties as the booker. Plain and simple. There's no other way around it. If you're somebody that watches AEW and wants to see that company do better, the first thing you ought to be doing is calling for Tony to step down from his active duties as the booker. He can keep his role as the president or the chief executive, whatever the official title is. But anything that pertains to the on-screen product, anything that we see on television that Tony has direct hands-on experience with or involvement with, You got to cut it. Tony cannot be overseeing anything that happens on the TV product. You need to hire real professionals that understand the business, the ones that have a vested interest to see AEW actually grow as an industry, somebody with a good mind for the business that understands how to book, has a true eye for talent, preferably a mind that isn't direct close friends with Tony Khan, since we know friend groups aren't necessarily AEW's strong suit. But that's where I'm going to leave it. I mean, at this point, it's no longer a matter of talking about what needs to happen. We all know the cold, hard truth. We know the problem. Everybody's been talking about this for the past 2 years. Tony is the problem. And the solution can only be resolved with somebody coming in to be a mediator. But it can't just be anybody. It's got to be a trustworthy mind that sees All Elite Wrestling as a business, not a vanity project. But with that all out of the way, now that I've virtually spent the last half hour or so talking about all the things I hated about wrestling in 2024, what do you say we flip that around and talk about some of the matches that I actually did enjoy this year? The list is small. I think last year, maybe even the year before too, didn't I do like a top 15 or top 20 list? Can't remember. Well, this year I narrowed it down to 10, both for time purposes and the harsh reality that I really couldn't think of more than 10 matches that stood out to me this year. Now, of course, everybody's lists are going to be different depending on the varying styles of wrestling you prefer or even the talents involved. I should preface all this by saying the list you're going to get from me is all WWE. And in particular, I'm only going to be covering the PLE matches that I watched. Nothing on this list is a television match. Nothing on this list comes from NXT. It only contains matches from the premium live specials. Also, I mean, it really shouldn't be a shock, but no AEW matches are going to come up on this list. And because of the fact that I didn't watch AEW this year, I mean, I really don't think it's fair for me to include any of their content on this list, because what am I judging the match by? Having not followed anything that was happening on the television product. So, everything you're getting from me here is all WWE related, since we actually watched and discussed the PLEs. And before I actually dive into the list, let me take a few minutes to talk about some of the matches that didn't make my list. Explicitly, the ones I know a lot of people are raving about this year. And I'll go ahead and start with the big one. I know this is going to be controversial, but if you're somebody that's been following me long enough, well, you know that controversial is my middle name. Anything to deviate from the collective opinion. Because more often than not, the collective opinion sucks. Roman Reigns versus Cody Rhodes from WrestleMania Night 2. Otherwise known as Cody finishing his story. If you haven't already, go listen to my review of that match earlier this year. I understand for a lot of people, the nostalgia of seeing all those legends show up in their cameos. I'm a taker mark myself. You all know that. Albeit I did kind of pop when he showed up to chokeslam The Rock. That was cool. But I still hated that fucking match. Hated it. I love the end result. I love seeing Cody pin Roman and finally finish his 2-year journey of coming back to the WWE to win his first major world championship. bringing a lot of that initial Bloodline story to closure after well over 12 months of investment. It was very cathartic to actually see something pay off in a good way for WWE. Instead of us being left with dejection and rage, which is what we saw primarily when Vince was overseeing the product. For me, it was the principle of how the match was booked that left a sour taste in my mouth. It was too overbooked. There was too much smoke and mirrors. To the point where when Cody finally did pin Roman, the only thing I kept saying to myself was, well, great. Glad it only took half a dozen fucking run-ins and chicanery from old-timers to help Cody seal the deal. Good to know he couldn't do it by himself. It should have been Cody's crowning moment. An authentic moment that he earned by fighting an uphill battle by himself. I mean, it was already a no DQ match anyway, from what I remember. And I was okay with the bloodline interference because it made contextual sense. Especially when you had the match from night one when Rock and Roman beat Cody and Seth in order to set up the bloodline rules stipulation. I was fine with all that. But God, the overbooked mess with the interference from Cena and Rock and Taker, just... You didn't need all that shit. And especially when it got to a point where Cody and Roman were uninvolved for like a full 5 minutes. They were just out on the floor selling while all this other crap was going on in the ring. Then it just turned into a giant nostalgia fap-off session with Rock and Cena and Taker. It was a detraction from the match. And again, I understand that I'm completely in the minority with that assertion. But two things can be true at once. You can still like certain aspects of a match while simultaneously loathing other parts. I did not hate the end result. I didn't even necessarily dislike the work between Cody and Roman. I don't remember a lot of the match offhand, but I also don't recall having an issue with anything they did. For me, though, there's a time and a place to book legend cameos and copious amounts of ref bump or interference spots. I can understand them wanting to keep everybody on edge with the near falls. To me, though, it just became way too much of a schmoz. To the point where it was just ridiculous. And I've tried going back and rewatching the match to see if maybe I was being too critical at the time. But after seeing it again, no, I still stand by what I said in April. Too much unnecessary overbooking. And I think it hurt Cody. I really do. Especially the people that were already overly critical of him to begin with. Because they were probably saying the same thing that I was. He didn't do it by himself. He needed help. But that's how I see it. And I wrote this one down too. It's not a huge deal or anything. But I remember hearing people talk about how this was a potential match of the year contender. And I was kind of shocked when I first heard it. I was like, really? Huh. Well, I didn't think it was that great. I'm talking about Cody Rhodes and AJ Styles from the Backlash special. And again, nothing against Cody or AJ, but I'm not exactly sure what it was about this match that people were considering it a match of the year. Unless your only qualification is work rate. I mean, it was good from what I remember. It was a totally predictable finish. I forget. Backlash was in France this year, right? I vaguely remember complaining about how distracting one of those international markets were. Just the fact that the crowd was going into business for themselves and doing a bunch of dumb singing and chanting for no reason, but they weren't actually really paying attention to what was happening in the matches. I don't remember if it was in France. But yeah, that was another match that I kind of turned my head at a little bit. Hearing people say Cody and AJ was a top match of the year contender. Maybe in the top 15. But it didn't make my list. And I really wasn't even contemplating it when I was putting the list together. I mean, I could probably rattle off a few others, but I don't want to get bogged down. I could throw in the Seth Rollins-Drew McIntyre World Title match from WrestleMania Night 2, because people love that match. For me, I think it was more about the post-match stuff with Punk than anything. I mean, Rollins and McIntyre, the match was okay. I remember not being a big fan of all the near-fall spamming going on, especially considering it was the opener for Night 2. Curtain jerking a world title match on WrestleMania and they're kicking out of every God-blessed move in the book. Come on. However, I love the afterbirth with Punk and McIntyre getting into that altercation by the announce booth after Drew spends like 5 minutes rubbing the title victory in Punk's face, Punk finally having enough of Drew showboating. And then after he took him out, you get the Damian Priest cash in. Yeah, that awesome visual of Punk laughing his ass off while Drew's just sitting in the ring looking totally despondent. And again, all to further the Punk McIntyre story while Punk was recovering from that tricep injury. Now, I don't want to spoil anything for later on, but we are going to be revisiting the Punk McIntyre feud a bit frequently in this list. Not that that really should surprise anybody. But I am going to start my list in descending order. It doesn't necessarily mean that any of these matches are better than others. It's my subjective take based on the credentials that I lay out for what I consider great matches. And there's a lot of different categories, but to kind of sum it up in quick succession here, for me, it's the talent involved, the story, the ring psychology, the crowd investment, placement, timing, execution. These are all factors that come into play when I'm tallying up my roster of favorite matches. I don't just throw things on a list because everybody did a bunch of cool moves. That's a problem with wrestling today is everybody's so surface level with how they grade matches. And I'm going to start right from number 10 here. A match that I remember not a whole lot of people were talking about after the show was over, and I kind of figured that was going to be the case. But LA Knight versus AJ Styles, WrestleMania 40, Night 1. I think I even talked about this when I reviewed the match. I kind of assumed it was going to be a dark horse when we reflected back on wrestling feuds in 2024. You know, one thing I'm always a sucker for in pro wrestling, especially when you're talking about the big four pay-per-views, I'm a big advocate of grudge matches between two top guys where there's nothing on the line but ego and bragging rights. You don't always need a belt at stake when you're piecing together a card comprised of your top guys. When it comes to AJ Styles and LA Knight, that whole feud, to me, that was the perfect program at the right place at the right time. And I always thought those guys had solid chemistry together. It was a rare case in modern wrestling where the babyface heel dichotomy wasn't completely fucked up. Remember, this is back when people were still semi-white hot for LA Knight, as opposed to lukewarm like they are nowadays. They knew this was a big deal for them. Getting a signature win on a WrestleMania card, fresh off that stellar run he had the year prior when the people really wanted to see him get a push. I thought AJ was a great dance partner for Knight. Everything they did in the match made sense. They actually worked it like a heated grudge feud where you bought everything they did to each other. And while it may have not been the most breathtaking or spot-oriented match in the world, it didn't need to be. You didn't need a bunch of flashy moments to stick in your stupid highlight reel package. It was two grown adult men in a work fight that made you buy they hated one another. Isn't that what pro wrestling's supposed to be? And that's why I knew this one would stand out by the end of the year. Because these two were actually trained properly, I could lose myself in the match and not get hung up on any bad indie habits. Because quite frankly, neither of these guys have any of those. They're both professionals. They understand the business. So that was a major plus going in. Again, it's just sad to see they totally dropped the ball on LA Knight's push ever since the end of the summer. But I'm going to re-examine that as we push forward through the list. And coming in at number 9, I have Bayley versus Io Sky, WrestleMania 40 Night 2. This is for one of the women's world titles. I still don't know which one is which. And I understand the timing of this might seem a little sus, since I literally just spent 15 minutes on the last PLE ranting about the state of WWE's women's division, as well as on this show. Probably didn't give you a whole lot of optimism that I'd even consider a girls' match making my list. And I will be the first to admit, I was never the biggest fan of Damage Control, but I could at least overlook some of the inner workings of the story to see the bigger picture as it unfolded. It was a very simple process of them slowly turning Bayley babyface over a period of months. All the deception going on with Io, Asuka, Dakota, and whoever the other girl was. Can't even remember, it's been so long. Was it Kairi Sane? The hell ever happened to that chick? God, I don't even remember the last time I talked about Kairi. Now that I think of it, when's the last time I talked about Asuka? Where the hell's she been? A lot of random disappearances with the women's division in this last calendar year. But really, the crowd was the focal point of this story ever getting over in the first place, because they really wanted to cheer for Bayley. Everything they did it with having the faction members talk shit behind her back, trying to basically force her out of Damage Control while bringing in new members without her knowledge or consent. I mean, it wasn't the greatest story arc in the world. I do still loosely remember getting a kick out of Bayley retorting back at Io, Asuka, and Kairi on television when they tried to shit-talk her in Japanese. But then it turned out Bayley actually knew Japanese. And I remember the face turn execution not being the best. But, I mean, when you think about it, Bayley was basically a heel for, something like 3 years running? I don't know if I would say she was stale as a villain, but I think that people naturally wanted to like her because she was so entertaining as a heel for all that time she wasn't able to work because of the knee injury. And the match, I thought, worked. The list of true top great female talent in WWE is very minuscule, but I still consider Bayley among those top 5. Easily. I understand Io's kind of an acquired taste for a lot of people, but I've always been a fan of her work. Even going back to her run in NXT all those years ago. Bayley, goes without saying. I mean, she still probably ranks among my favorite on that superficial 4 horsewomen tier that people coined a decade ago. It was always a toss-up between her and Becky. Personally, I would not say Bayley's run has been remarkable since that Mania match with Io. Like, her dropping the belt to Nia Jax earlier this year was a total boneheaded move. And she's mostly been floating around aimlessly since that point. Kind of falls back on what I was talking about with LA Knight, which again, I'll go more in depth in a few minutes. But Bayley kind of lines up in that same camp. It kind of seems like they had a pre-planned destination for her to arrive at winning the belt at WrestleMania, But it's everything after the fact that you're like, okay, did they actually have anything planned for her after she won the belt? Well, clearly the answer was no. So it's kind of a bittersweet thing. It's great she got that big Mania moment. It was cool to see her get a bit of revenge on her former Damage Control comrades. But where did it leave her in the grand scheme of things? Other than treading water as a directionless champion for a few months. And I don't know what their plans are for her in 2025. Based on what I've seen from her lately, and the last of which was her being involved in that clusterfuck War Games match, doesn't leave me a whole lot of confidence going forward. Number 8. Sami Zayn versus Chad Gable. Clash of the Castle 2024. My God, man. You want to talk about a fall from grace. Moreover, you just want to talk about a guy that you assume WWE is never going to get it with. Chad Gable, dude. I mean, if they haven't gotten it with him by now, is it safe to say the bloom is forever off the rose? And it's a shame, too, because, well, not that I'm purposefully trying to compare all these overlapping stories, but it kind of goes back to the premise of the Damage Control stuff. Alpha Academy? Meh. Personally, I never got it. I know they were really hamming up the campiness of the group when Vince was still primarily running things. And they kind of toned back a little bit off the goofiness when they started having Gable transition into more of the domineering, overly abusive coach. But I never got the appeal of Model Girl. It's funny how I don't even know her name offhand. I just know her as Model Girl because of listening to Cornette's podcasts. I mean, it doesn't matter. Does she ever wrestle? But in terms of how I've settled on this match making the list, it really stems from everything they did in the lead-up of getting Gable over as this manipulative, slimeball, abrasive heel. And I actually kind of like the dynamics with him and Otis. Again, when they finally dropped Otis being a bumbling idiot all the time, like the whole story going in with Gable being obsessed about winning the Intercontinental belt. I mean, I think they were only like maybe a month or two into his heel run by that point, right? Because they only really established his turn shortly after WrestleMania. And of course, Sammy trying to be the voice of reason and get Otis to stand up for himself and the group, not letting the smaller, measly coach manipulate him all the time. I mean, there were a lot of things that just naturally fell into place here. Because this was essentially the blow-off to Alpha Academy, was it not? I don't think we ever got a true resolution to the split with Otis and Chad Gable. Because Otis kind of walked off with Model Girl here, and that was kind of it. Remember, they shot the angle at the end where Gable accidentally clipped her in the back of the knee. And the people were ready to see Otis blow up and finally beat the crap out of Gable. But instead, he just picked her up and carried her to the back. And then Sammy won with the haluva kick. But did we ever get a singles payoff between Otis and Gable? Unless they did it on television. Or did they just leave him high and dry right before they kickstarted this American-made group with him and the Creed brothers? Haven't really kept tabs on how that's all going. But it's just kind of sad to think this will probably be the closest Gable ever comes to sniffing singles gold. Because when you remove the story elements, this is a damn good match. It's the one thing that's always come naturally to Chad Gable as a wrestler. Even when you go back and watch his American Alpha stuff, aside from being a phenomenal athlete, he just instinctually understands wrestling psychology. He's very good at working both sides of the fence as needed. His promo work, I think, has always been really solid. He's just always been a victim of the machine. No matter what regime he's been under, they've only been willing to go so far with him before yanking the rug out from under him. No, I'm not suggesting he should be their world champion or anything. I think we're a little past the point of return there, especially with the way he's been misused over the years. It'd be hard to buy him as a world champion after all the shitty gimmicks he's been saddled with. Shorty G. Enough said. Oh, then again, Cody Rhodes was Stardust once upon a time, and he managed to overcome that. But not to compare the two, because Chad Gable is not Cody Rhodes. But even when I thought back and watched the match in preparation for this show, the thing that continues to stand out to me, fuck, Chad Gable is so good. Great wrestler, great worker, great overall personality. I just kind of wish the company viewed him the same way that so many of the fans do. But this is absolutely a match that I remember enjoying the first time I saw it. And it still holds up. Going back and watching it 6 something months later. And now we've come to what was, without a doubt, my humble irrelevant opinion, WWE's feud/rivalry of the year. Maybe even feud/rivalry of the last several years when we look back in time. It's one thing to keep a feud hot for multiple stretches of time, especially given the current climate of modern wrestling fans and their lack of patience for anything. But when you factor in everything we've seen, the fact that we never even officially got the first match between these two until like 8 months into the program, that is what makes this an all-time classic in my book. A feud that, quite frankly, I don't even know if WWE ever considered in their initial plans. It was just sort of something that fell into their lap involuntarily. They were just smart enough to run with it. All because of one spot in the Rumble match back in January, when Drew McIntyre went to give CM Punk the Future Shock DDT, or whatever he calls a double-arm DDT. And it was just one of those fluke deals where a legit injury that, on the one hand, threw their entire WrestleMania plans into disarray. Because remember, they were supposed to do Rollins and Punk on night 1 of WrestleMania. All signs were pointing to that being Punk's WrestleMania program. And while we didn't get that, what we did get instead was arguably leaps and bounds better. We just had to wait 8+ months to finally get it. And was it worth the wait? Oh, fuck yeah, it was. Are you kidding? And I'll go ahead and ruin the surprise. No, this is not the only Punk McIntyre match that made my list. In fact, as you can tell here, 2 of them are kind of side by side. But all 3 of their matches made my list. And I could tie in the strap match with this one just to kind of talk about both of them back to back. Not to say that one superseded the other. Although I personally enjoyed the strap match a little more than I enjoyed the SummerSlam match. It was actually another rare instance in a wrestling trilogy where I thought each match got subsequently better. And you also have to account, the SummerSlam match was Punk's true first match back in WWE. The Rumble was a fixed case. Yeah, Punk was technically a part of the match, but in terms of going bell to bell and having the spotlight solely focused on him, Punk's involvement was very sparse. I mean, him and Cody in the closing moments was probably the closest he came to actually working a full-fledged match. And he was already fucked up anyway by that point because of the tricep tear. The big critique I remember hearing about the SummerSlam match was that Rollins intervening was a little too overbearing. And I even said, I really don't like the idea of Rollins being milked into this thing as a guest referee. However, considering what they're currently doing with Punk and Rollins now, at least they're finally revisiting that issue and trying to go back to it after putting it on ice after a few months. So I can at least look back and say, well, okay, it was done with a purpose. It wasn't just done and then forgotten about. They still hate each other. They still have a beef to squash. Fine. I think the strap match for me was a lot easier to sink my teeth into. I never liked the whole touch all four corners of the ring thing. I always thought that stipulation was kind of stupid. But I love the use of the strap gimmick because it was a way for them to do something more edgy and hard-hitting without it just kind of turning into a generic plunder match. Again, take into account the two parties here. Two pros. They get the business. They don't need to rely on stupid car wreck shit to tell a comprehensive story and or draw money and sell tickets. I know people hated the bracelet thing. I didn't mind the use of it. I think the problem was a lot of these so-called smarter fans bought into the notion of it just being this materialistic thing rather than the overall framework of what the bracelet signified in the story. I mean, yeah, visually it was just a piece of plastic with some bands and beads wrapped around it. But for Punk, it was a gift that a fan made for him. And it was something Drew stole and destroyed in order to spite Punk. Not because Drew gave a shit about the bracelet, but because he loathed the idea of somebody or a group of people actually being a CM Punk fan. He was jealous. He detested it. That's why he stole the bracelet. Again, bigger picture, people. Let's try not to be so narrow-focused all the goddamn time. But when I watch these two matches back, again, it's not necessarily that one's better than the other. Contextually, they're two completely different matches with two different issues at play, which is why I kind of lean more on the strap match as the overall better match, whatever your subjective definition of better happens to be. But they're still both of equal importance in the timeline of the Punk-McIntyre feud. Stay posted, because we're not done talking about it yet. Then we have number 5. LA Knight versus Logan Paul, SummerSlam. And it's kind of another bittersweet conversation we need to have. I said we'd resume the talking points on LA Knight. Well, here we are. And it just sucks, dude. Because I really liked this match when I saw it live. I mean, looking back in the rear view 6 months later, this might have been LA Knight's last truly great moment. After this, he had a massive brick wall. What was supposed to be a crowning achievement of him finally winning singles gold after years of being mismanaged and undervalued. Well, he got his moment. And it's everything it led to as a result where you're left thinking, so what the fuck happened? To tell you the truth, I still don't know. Aside from piss poor booking and bad management. It doesn't make sense to me. It's the timeless fable of the thrill of the chase being more captivating than the actual triumph. Because when you finally see the hero triumph, everything afterwards is nothing but a steady decline. Then it all leads to him losing the strap to Shinsuke Nakamura in a completely forgettable match second on the card at Survivor Series. But it's just like the stuff with him and AJ. I was begging for them to do this fucking program like a year ago. Logan Paul and LA Knight? That was always a no-brainer to me. The promo work alone between these two, I thought that was a lot of fun. Say what you want about Logan Paul, dude. Yeah, he's kind of a piece of shit in real life. But that's what makes his gimmick so great in WWE. Because it's genuine. He doesn't have to pretend to be somebody he's not. What you see on camera is just an extension of the real Logan Paul. Turned up about 50 more clicks. Sometimes those are the best personalities in wrestling. The guys or girls that are just their authentic selves. So the babyface heel dynamic in this feud absolutely worked. The people were ready to see LA Knight finally get a big win. They already kind of assumed going in that he was going to beat Logan to win the belt here. For the first time in I don't know how long, the idea of somebody actually winning a mid-card belt in WWE meaning anything worth a shit. There were so many things that appropriately lined up in this scenario. And again, man, it's the after effect. Where now we're left sitting here wondering, how is it possible that they fucked it up that badly? You put the strap on Knight. You don't do jack shit with him for months. You involve him in all these mediocre title programs with goofballs like Andrade and Carmelo Hayes, guys that couldn't draw money with paper and green crayon. Let's just call it like it is. Those two are never going to be a star. Then you have him drop the belt on Nakamura in late November. What was the point of that title reign if that's all it was going to amount to? And if you do have bigger plans for LA Knight in 2025, you're surely not making it abundantly clear based on the shitty way he's been presented since late August. Because his momentum has gone completely down the tubes. Like just me going back and listening to the fan reception, not only when LA Knight made his entrance, but when he actually won the belt at the end of the match. The people were hanging on to everything he did. It was set up so perfectly for him. And yeah, I know there's still Rumble season. Do I personally expect LA Knight to win the 2025 Royal Rumble? No, not really. Is it feasible? Yeah. Probable? No. There's a big distinction there. But I still can't take away from the work these guys did together. And I understand it was mainly just a one-and-done blow-off. Sort of a way to write Logan Paul out of the equation for the time being. The jury's still out on what his future is going to be. But this is a hell of a match. And a really fun program to go back and check out. And we're slowly edging to the end here. Coming in at number 4, I have Gunther versus Sami Zayn WrestleMania Night 2. You knew Gunther would have to make the list eventually, right? This is an interesting match from what I remember. I figured people were going to have conflicting opinions on whether or not Sami should have been the guy to end Gunther's IC title reign. I think now, especially with hindsight being 2020, now that they got the strap on Braun Breaker, the title change made sense. At the end of the day, Sami was a short-term transitional champion, so they had a proper babyface in place to lose the belt to Breaker. There was nothing wrong with it. When it comes to the Gunther-Sami program, again, it was the perfect feud that I thought played to the strengths of both talents. Gunther flourishes as the big mean bully that beats on the littler guy. Sami's best attribute is the fact that he can sell his ass off. So him being able to feed for Gunther and work as the valiant underdog babyface, everything just came together organically. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong on this, it's been a while since I thought back about it, Wasn't the whole backstory in the feud that Gunther kept refusing to give Sammy a title shot? Mainly because of the fact that he had already beaten Sammy like twice before. The fact that Gunther always underestimated Sammy from the jump. It's not the most revolutionary thing in the pantheon of wrestling tales, but it's easy to digest. And again, the match still holds up. It may have not been the greatest WrestleMania match in the modern era, but I think about Sammy in particular, the incredible work he's done in the last couple of years on WWE television. I mean, he's kind of become their underground MVP. All that great business he's done with the Bloodline. Thinking back the year before, that title match with Roman before WrestleMania, I still remember that match. And then a month later, him winning the tag straps with Kevin Owens in Mania. Those angles and promos with the Bloodline that were always exceptionally entertaining. And there's never been a dull moment when Sammy's been on television. And, I mean, can you easily chalk the title win up to being a consolation prize? I guess it kind of depends on perspective. For me, I thought it was a well-earned title victory. Even if it was short-lived, and it was just kind of a way for them to get the belt on Breaker a few months later. And here we go, number 3. This is probably going to be a pivotal turning point for me on the FSWR channel, so make sure y'all jot this down for future reference. If you want to hold it against me. Now, let me preface my comment by saying, in no way am I insinuating that I've become a fan of his. However, I think I finally turned the corner on Randy Orton. It took me, I don't know, give or take 15 years. But I think I'm good with Randy now. My previous issues with him, I say we consider that water under the bridge. For anybody confused, well, I've talked about Randy Orton in the past plenty. There was a period back in like the early to mid 2010s, maybe even late 2000s. I couldn't stand the guy. I hated the way he was booked, hated the way he was being forced down my throat, hated the way he conducted himself on a professional level, just being a raging, out-of-control egomaniac. And he has since then apologized for his unprofessionalism. So for anybody thinking I'm making shit up on the fly, Orton's talked about it. You want a good reference, go listen to that clip of him talking with CM Punk about the WrestleMania match. You'll get a better sense of what I'm referring to. But I've actually seen the positive attitude change just in the last couple years. You know, especially since he's come back from that horrible back injury that ideally should have ended his career. He's calmer. He's less agitated. He's not trying to get himself over at the expense of the guys he's doing business with. And of course, I think a lot of that comes with age. I think Randy knows his place on the card these days. He's still a big name for them. He's a valuable asset. But does he need to be winning world championships or getting signature defining wins over guys they're trying to establish as the next generation of stars? Hell no. Absolutely not. And the problem was the fact that I talked about that over a decade ago, when Orton was actively going out of his way to bury guys like Kofi Kingston or Wade Barrett. Didn't he, wasn't he mainly responsible for getting Mr. Kennedy fired? Remember when that guy was supposed to be a big deal? But again, It's in the past. I don't have to complain about any of this being an issue in 2024. And I'm glad. I know this is digging up ancient history. I don't want to belabor old talking points like that. The point I'm getting at is that it's taken me a very long time to come around to Randy. But even I'm somebody that can have his mind changed. If the evidence presents itself, I turn the corner on Shawn Michaels, and I've seen the improvement with Randy's professionalism in WWE over the last several years. So when I talk about a match like him and Gunther, the King of the Ring finals, it was easy for me to immerse myself in the action, knowing that we're dealing with the 2024 version of Randy Orton, not the 2014 version. And of course, going in, at no point did I ever actually think Orton was going to win the King of the Ring. It just didn't seem like a natural fit. King Gunther always sounded better on paper. What I recall looking back and loving so much about this match, aside from the fact that, again, you're kind of seeing a pattern develop when it comes to me comprising my list of favorite matches, two grown-ass looking adult men. I'm looking at two visibly imposing athletes that I can believably buy as badasses. It's not a bunch of schoolchildren-sized indie goofs that are barely bigger than me. And I'm not a big guy by any stretch of the imagination. It was just one of those hard-hitting, old-school type matches that I could see on any kind of card back in the territory days. Something a Bill Watts would have promoted as an attraction match for the Superdome. Something that could have worked in just about any region of the country. Florida, Tennessee, Texas, Minnesota, anywhere in the Carolinas. And again, there's nothing overly convoluted about the story they told. It was all about working body limbs. It's about two guys trying to settle a score on who the better man is. And even though Gunther technically goes over, you still get that memorable controversial finish where Orton's shoulders aren't technically pinned down when the ref counts 3. So they leave you with a little bit of an unsettled issue coming out of it. All of which is resumed and settled at Bash in Berlin. I mean, you knew they were going to be interlinked somehow, right? But the same thing, man. What a fucking match. And again, because of the unresolved beef from the previous one, this was even more of a big fight feel in the second match. It was also for the World Heavyweight title, which one might argue is a bigger deal than the artificial title of King of the Ring. But it all goes back to what I just said. You see two guys of a similar size and stature working a match like this in 2024, and you come to realize how much of a rarity it truly is. Now, of course, the one issue you had, because they were in Berlin, the crowd psychology was a bit fucked up. Even though Orton was supposed to be the babyface, the people were almost unanimously behind Gunther. So, there's that. But trying to extract that from the conversation, you saw them working a much different style match as opposed to the first one. Whereas the first match was more about them trying to figure each other out, their strengths and weaknesses. I think the second match was more of a chance for them to exploit those various strengths and weaknesses, whether it was countering more offense or, Randy trying to be more cognizant of the leg injury this time. One thing I always talk about, it's the subtle little things in a match that take it from being good and can automatically make it great. Just by paying attention and honing in on those small little nuances. Obviously, I could talk for hours about Gunther as the world champion. I mean, he's had a hell of a streak so far. I mean, just look at him in the last couple years. I forget the stat. Isn't it like he's been a champion in WWE for like 80% of his tenure? Spread across NXT and the main roster runs. I mean, Hey, say what you want about the difference between Vince and Hunter in terms of philosophy when it comes to booking. They both saw Gunther on equal playing fields. And he really is just one of those guys where you look at and you're like, titles suit him extremely well, don't they? You look at his profile and you're like, he would look great with a belt around his waist. But yeah, Gunther and Orton, one of my favorite little mini feuds this year. I mean, easily my favorite thing I've seen them do with either party in a while. And that includes Gunther feuding with Sammy, which is also pretty good. But of course, there can only be one number one spot. My number one pick for match of 2024. And if it wasn't already obvious based on everything I've set up previously, then I don't know what to tell you. For me, I don't even think it's up for debate. If you're even semi-objective in your take on professional wrestling, and you're not totally caught up in the punk derangement syndrome bubble, all the other matches on this list pale in comparison to this one. People said it was going to be match of the year the minute it was over. And for me, nothing has come close to topping it, previously or after the fact. So let's talk about it. CM Punk versus Drew McIntyre. Hell in a Cell. Bad Blood. Where do you start? Is it fair to say that the CM Punk Drew McIntyre feud was one of the best inadvertent programs in the modern era? Inadvertent as in something they were never originally planning to do, but they absolutely had to run with. Unless they were just fucking idiots. And let me just start by getting the negative out of the way. A small thing I'm not going to overstress because, I mean, I know it's something that I've beaten into the ground as a talking point. WWE, more specifically, Vince McMahon killed the Hell in a Cell stipulation. Just neuter that fucking thing into the ground. Years and years and years and years of endless cell-themed live event specials. I mean, it really got to a point where the Hell in a Cell gimmick just became like every other modern gimmick match WWE does. Money in the Bank, the Rumble, Elimination Chamber, you name it. It was just... It was no longer special. It became the annual thing to do because, well, it's October season, which means we have to break out the Cell pay-per-view. Regardless of whether or not we actually have rivalries that need to be paid off inside the Cell. Fuck it, we're just going to do it anyway. So with that in mind, I'm glad they finally canned the whole Hell in a Cell PLE. Bad Blood is a pay-per-view that has a lot of nostalgic leverage. People often associate Bad Blood with the Cell. And because you had an actual blood feud that fit the necessitation of doing a Hell in a Cell. Again, it goes back to that talking point from earlier. Timing and placement. It was all proper here. And the thing that made it so easy for me, like the fact that I didn't even need to contemplate what would make number one on my list. When I'm going back and structuring the list, going through my typical editing procedure, you know, I knew I was going to be devoting a day to going back and rewatching all these matches in full. Out of all the 10 matches on this list, there was only one that I legitimately could not wait to go back and watch again. Like, I was genuinely excited to see this match. And which one was it? Drew and Punk in the Cell. It was the perfect blow-off to what is without a doubt my favorite WWE storyline / feud probably in years. Yes, that includes anything they've previously done with the Bloodline. I even love the Punk McIntyre stuff more than I enjoyed the Sami Zayn-Roman Reigns feud prior to last year's WrestleMania. Build up and all. The timeline, the promo interaction, the angles, the arc of how they tied everything together for over 8 months without ever having these two have a single solitary match. Everything was must-see. And again, I know them throwing Rollins in there was a temporary monkey wrench, but you had the layered story of what they had previously started with Rollins and Punk before the Rumble, dating back to when he returned at Survivor Series last year. You just couldn't leave all that untouched for over a year. But even incorporating Rollins in the lead up to Survivor Series, the primary focus was still on Drew and Punk. Or did I say Survivor Series? I meant SummerSlam. Sorry. But you get what I mean. I love going back and watching the clips from Raw. Again, the promo work was outstanding. Drew just being a condescending prick for weeks and weeks until finally Punk retaliated at WrestleMania and fucked him out of the world title. The stuff at the Clash at the Castle PLE when Punk ran down as the disguised referee and then Punk drew out of the belt again. No pun intended there. Then him costing Drew his Money in the Bank cash-in. I mean, Drew could never get a leg up on this guy. He could badmouth and smash talk this guy until he was blue in the face. Every single time that Drew thought he was in the driver's seat, he got thwarted. It's like the Austin McMahon dynamic. McMahon was the heel. He thought that he was in charge. But goddamn, every time Austin would come down and stun the shit out of him, you realize that the babyface just always had the advantage. All the things they did just to cover up for the fact that Punk wasn't medically cleared to compete. But they wanted to have him involved because he was still a ratings boost, and he still is. So you throw him out there, you book him in angles, you book him in promos, you get him out in front of the people to stay hot. And think, too, people often neglect this. This was the hottest thing going on television at one point. Even hotter than anything they were doing with the Bloodline. Granted, they were on two separate brands, but people tuned in to see this stuff. And the end result, it's exactly what it needed to be. Punk going over. But you look back at everything they did together in the Cell match, the violence, the double juice, the punishment they both took in order to sell the gravity of the story after 10 months of hatred. I mean, it was the closest thing to a hardcore match without actually ever becoming a garbage match. Again, major difference between the two people. Yes, they used gimmicks. Yes, they hit each other with shit. Yes, they bled. Everything they did, though, was done with a purpose. And that's the key. It wasn't violence for the sake of violence. They weren't trying to pop the crowd with meaningless stunts. You bought everything that was happening. You bought that everything going on in the ring was done with the sole purpose of these two hate each other. They want to kill one another. They will go to any length to do it. Even if it meant Punk busting open Drew Hardway with a toolbox. But it was flawless. And I knew the minute it was over, nothing is going to come close to topping this match. This is hands down, no conversation, one of the greatest all-time WWE matches. Now, I know that scale is very skewed by today's standards, but I always judge it this way. Is this a match that I would rewatch time and time again and never get bored with? Yes. Is it something that any audience or any fan base could understand and engross themselves in? Yes. Did it encapsulate the mood, the environment, the story, and the timeline of everything to get to that point? Without a doubt. Yes. And, well, let me close it out by saying this, and then we'll wrap up here, because I know we're going long. How do I want to phrase this? This weird, strange anti-CM Punk culture we stumbled across, it is exactly that. To me, it's just weird. Put it this way. I understand not being a fan of somebody. I understand having an issue with the way somebody's being booked or presented. But this vehement CM Punk hatred, especially amongst the hardcore fan base, I mean, we've been dealing with it for well over 3 or 4 years now. It almost seems like a personal vendetta at this point. It's not even the idea of people hating CM Punk the gimmick. They loathe the existence of Phillip Brooks. And that is a dangerous mindset to have. But, you know, you think this is all stuff that promulgated largely because of the AEW fanatics. Anybody that bought into the propaganda that Punk was a toxic employee. But it is so bizarre seeing Punk operate in both these worlds in back-to-back years. The difference between Punk and AEW versus Punk and WWE. We're not even talking about the same person. And you're still going to have these so-called credible journalists and media sources that are attempting to downplay the significance of the Punk-McIntyre feud for no other purpose than CM Punk bad. And I really think you should take that into consideration as you're listening to these other media outlets and as they're coming out with their matches of the year. As subjective as those lists are, even if the Punk-McIntyre cell match ranks among the top 3, really ask yourself something. What are the standards for what truly makes an all-time great match? Think about how rare it is we see that anymore. You do not get rivalries or grudges or blow-offs like CM Punk and Drew McIntyre every year. I know people often like to think it that way. But they are rarities. Or I guess we could call them anomalies. But especially as we move into 2025, even if you're somebody that's on the fence about CM Punk, somebody that doesn't really have much of an opinion of him one way or the other, look at the way the WWE audience views him versus the way the niche AEW fan base does. Look at how Punk is talked about on these media platforms compared to what you actually see of him on camera. Judge it that way. Is Punk flawed? Yes. Have I agreed with every way he's conducted himself over the last few years? No. But is he this violent, unhinged lunatic that can't be contained? Is he really this guy that AEW spent the better part of the last 2 years trying to sabotage and actively run out of the company because he was a threat to the locker room? You tell me. What am I missing? I'm yet to be provided with any substantial proof or evidence that Punk was not justified in the way he conducted himself under Tony Khan's jurisdiction. And for all the people that shamelessly attack or target CM Punk as the problem from day one, you are getting mocked, ridiculed, and laughed at right now. I hope you all realize that. Because while CM Punk is doing banner business for WWE, your little glorified niche indie promotion is running off more people than ever. So again, who's at fault? Who's the one that really came out on the better end? Those little smarmy pussy bucks taking victory laps around the ring? Who's taking the victory lap now? You fucking little pea brains. But there you have it. That's my list. 10 matches. Notice too how nothing on this list was a multi-man clusterfuck stipulation match. There's a reason for that. I hate those matches. And at the same time, I'm a very simple wrestling fan. I always have been. You give me two guys or gals with a real heated issue that I can believably sink my teeth into. I'm not hard to please. I might have my qualms with the booking or structure, agenting in other words. But it's really not rocket science, dude. Of course, I always engage my viewers to chime in with your thoughts. Give me your list of favorite matches. If there's something here that I left off that you think warrants consideration above anything else, I'd like to hear it. And again, you have to factor in the caveats that I talked about. The fact that I'm only talking about main roster WWE matches. But I'd love to hear some other considerations as well. Get some engagement going here as we move into the new year. But that is going to wind out this show. And that is going to wind out the final podcast for the year 2024. What a roller coaster ride it has been. But I want to thank you all for tuning in to watch. And again, make sure you subscribe, comment, like the show if you have not already. Come back to check us out on Rumble and YouTube on Mondays and Fridays for new shows. And as I talked about earlier, the structure of the show is going to be primarily the same in the coming year. I don't really plan on adding or taking away anything. Still kind of up in the air with the Retro Raw stuff. I think I do have a means of at least continuing forward with the reviews in the short term. But anything can change. So, stay tuned for more fun activity. And I'll catch you all soon. Happy New Year. And I'll see you all in the next one. Peace out.